Welcome back to the Growing Band Director podcast. This is episode number 105. I'm really blessed to be here with Laura Estes. Laura is a band director for 36 years from Georgia and grew up originally in Florida. Before retiring in 2018, Laura taught middle school and high school band for 36 years, most recently in Cobb County School System as the associate band director at Smitha Middle School. Ms. Estes was awarded the National Band Association Citation of Excellence as her middle and high school bands were selected on multiple occasions to perform at clinics in both Georgia and Alabama, and has also given clinics to future music educators at the university level. So I'm really excited to have her here. Laura, how you doing?
I'm doing great.
When Laura and I were talking about her rehearsal strategies, you sent me a message about that your rehearsal mantra was craft your rehearsals for student success.
Yeah.
And you sort of sent me, I don't know if it's a title or not, but I wrote down 13 tips for like ways to clean a band, basically, right? Ways to get your band to sound great. So I'd like to start with that in a second. But before, as you look back on your time as a band director, what are some keys that you felt like were important to your success as a teacher?
Oh, well, I just always tried to remember what it was like myself, singing in band, and how excited I was and how much fun I was having. And I just wanted to try and recreate that for the students. Of course, looking back, I'm trying to recreate it with the knowledge of being a band director and not the knowledge of being a student. So I just wanted to give them opportunities that I didn't have and just teach the kids that really what the definition of fun is more like enjoyable and learning.
Sure.
It's feeling like you're learning something.
I also want to mention you're sort of part of my superhero series, the band directors who are also moms thing. It's so amazing. You guys are all a blessing. Okay, so the first one you have written down is diagnose potential musical problems in the ensemble before they occur. So for young teachers who hear that, they might not have any idea what you're talking about.
Well, I certainly didn't know what that meant when I was young. I think that when I had my first middle school band, I mostly just checked for range. Did I have these instruments that the score called for? What did the rhythms look like? Things like that.
Sure.
I didn't really know how to delve deeper or what to look for. And so there are just so many things that I missed. And it certainly does not lead to student success when you can avoid things before they happen. So that's, I just learned how to do that. Like, one, for example, might be if you're dealing with a clarinet A against a flute G for inordinate amounts of time, because that's going to be a super challenge for the kids to try and get that in tune.
Can you tell us why that's going to be a super challenge?
Because the clarinets are sharp on that note, naturally sharp, and the flutes are naturally flat. And so with the young students, they don't realize that. I mean, you're trying to teach them intonation, but why on purpose would you give them something that's so difficult to do unknowingly, unless you say to them, I'm giving you this piece because we're going to be working on concert G intonation. That's a little different than just handing them a piece like that. And so many young middle school band pieces are written in concert C, because it lays well with the instruments and, with the ranges for most of the instruments. And so I just didn't know to check for that, but that's a biggie right there.
One thing that I think it's great, we're going to start talking later on in the session about the switch you made to composer and and the background in some of your music, and we're going to listen to a couple of your pieces. But people need to know that if they're playing one of your pieces, you're taking all the knowledge you've taken from all of your time teaching, and now that goes into your composer side. So when you write a piece, when people have played one of your pieces, they know that you've been there and that you know what those bands are like and you write it accordingly. I was also thinking, as you're choosing a new piece, think about like note inventory. Like, are there notes in this piece your kids don't know? Are there rhythms in here they don't know? And if there are, then it's important you teach them that, hopefully before the piece comes up. And there's so many things on that, but just really doing your score study ahead of time, I think is a really, really, really important thing.
But not just knowing the score, but knowing, we can all know our scores, and then you pass it out to the students and you have no idea why something isn't working. Mm-hmm. And so you just, over time, you just learn. I didn't know in the beginning. I really didn't. I just would pass out a piece, and I would just innately know that this isn't working, but I couldn't always figure out why. And as a young teacher, super young, I would blame the students. I taught you that rhythm. I taught you that note. Well, yeah, I did. And the students understand that. They understand that note. They understand that rhythm. But why isn't it working? Well, maybe you passed out a piece that was pretty soloistic in nature, or you're playing that same rhythm, but there's only two other people playing it in the room, or, things like that. And you haven't accounted for homophonic versus soloistic, which is huge with young students. You have to be super careful with that.
It's also really important that people understand, especially the younger they are, the more repetition they need. Like, you might have taught it once, but have you taught it 10, 15,000 times?
And that was definitely something I had a learning curve that I had to learn when I was younger. Again, you just have to put yourself back when you're that age, and you learn repetition.
One of the other things you mentioned was choosing quality literature, and I think there's another part of that, and I think everybody would try to choose quality literature. I would add to that, if you don't mind, choose quality literature for your students, because sometimes we choose quality literature that is too hard or too easy or not right or whatever. So what are some things that went into you and still do when you're choosing programs? What are things that you try to do to make sure you're choosing appropriate level?
Well, again, trial and error, but you kind of, I guess when you're choosing a program, you want to maybe tell a story. And so, you kind of start with some kind of a warm up that they'll immediately do really well on and feel comfortable with. Maybe that I'm talking the youngest of students. All of this applies for all grade levels, of course, but at varying degrees. So something kind of homophonic and moves along, isn't super slow, or things like that they'll just feel very confident on in the beginning, and then maybe move into the more challenging literature, and then you could either continue with the challenging or then back off just a little bit into what the students might call more fun.
Sure.
Things like that. So, there's that in building a program. And then also there's an art to figuring out how far you can push them with the latest concepts that you've taught, because you want that program to sound as polished as possible. But even that, maybe it's a spring concert and you don't need it to be as polished as possible, because your goal is to give them something harder to prepare them for the following school year, so that you start at the next level. So it's pretty intricate It just depends on the type of concert that you're going for, and the students that you have in front of you. I mean, how many times have we miscalculated, and maybe not miscalculated what they're capable of or what they should be doing, but maybe miscalculated, are they going to practice the music? And then you have to pull back. That's happened.
There's a couple of things that come to mind as you're speaking about that. One is really knowing your students, like not only how they play musically and what they can do and the pedagogy on their instrument. I mean, there's so much to learn here, but knowing how they are as kids and how you can push them and all that. And you're right, it's a gift that you grow as you teach longer and longer. But more importantly, or equally as importantly, I would say, is getting mentors and other people in your area who can help you along the journey.
Oh yeah. Now, when I started teaching, there were only 2 schools. I started teaching in Key West, Florida. And so there were only, it was either, for my musical fulfillment, it was either coming from my own middle school band or the high school band, which was quite good. And it was, I was just so fortunate that that high school band director was such a good mentor to me, because sometimes he would come to one of my rehearsals and I'd be so proud. And then at the end, I'd look at him and I'd see his face, and it was like, oops, there's so many things of you don't even know what you don't know. And so
Sure.
I just learned early on that whatever you think you know, there's a bunch more that you don't even know you don't know yet.
And the more time you teach, the more you realize you don't know.
Yes.
You feel like you know less and less.
Yes.
You mentioned in our communications ahead of time a couple of things that you look for as well. Melodic material in all the sections. Like when I was talking with Tiffany Hitz, she said, I love me a low brass melody, so that all the sections can get the melody. Percussion difficulty levels, the fact that you're utilizing percussion enough. You put a comment in here, choosing the right literature helps to prevent behavior issues.
Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh. Yes.
I think everybody's agreeing.
So let's just talk about percussion for a minute. So this is something that it took me a while to figure out. Even if you have to leave percussion parts out for some reason or rewrite it, you have to find them very challenging rhythms. You have to find that you get them on, utilize as many different instruments as you possibly can. That's why they signed up to be percussionists. They just want to hit things and bang on things and make neat sounds and come up with new things. And it took me a while to figure that out. But that if you give out percussion parts that are super repetitive, where the first 2 measures just repeat themselves incessantly, I think we can all think of music like that. And they're going to pretty much sight read it the first time. Well, they're bored when you're working your wind players, and you can include them as much as you can. When I have to rehearse sections, whether it's clarinets or it doesn't matter what it is, I always have percussion you play, or you're air playing, or you're doing something, or you're my human metronome. I just have them constantly going. But if their parts are still repetitive, that they kind of got it on the first run through or the second run through, you're just asking for trouble,
Totally.
with behavior issues. And I understand this intimately because piano is my main instrument. Sax is my band instrument. And in college, we were put on our secondaries for conducting class.
Mm-hmm.
So they put me back in the percussion section. It was so easy to fool around. And we spent a lot of time figuring out how we were going to mess up our friends who were on the podium. I'm embarrassed to say. And so I remember that. And then when I student taught, the band had 20 something percussionists, one class when I'm
Wow.
student teaching. And I was like, oh no, what are we, all those percussionists? And they were so well trained.
Mm-hmm.
And it was whoever was assigned, this is a high school, whoever was assigned to a piece, they got up, the rest of them sat quietly and listened. And I was like, wow. It came from
Yeah.
my student conducting of fooling around in the percussion section to the complete and most professional opposite. So I
Yeah.
just always remember those things.
Yeah, I was thinking too, I know some band directors like to have a kid on snare and a kid on timpani and they're mallet players and they're auxiliary players and they stay on the same thing throughout. I've always been a big believer of rotating and sure, maybe on your hardest piece, maybe put the kids where they go, but and I think it's okay to if you're a new teacher or a teacher who would start that, you're going to get a little resistance just in the kids who would say, "Well, I like this more, I like that more," and that's fine, but rotating parts helps a lot with that too. And a lot of times if you're in your program when they start beginning band, if you can get them to have the beginning band teacher start them on mallets instead of on drums, at least for the first 6 months, I think that's a great way to go. I also learned, you were talking about air playing for the percussion. Another thing people can do, if everybody like pretends to hold their drumsticks here for a second, just pretend like you're holding drumsticks, and then if you flip the tip around so it's touching almost your elbow underneath on your forearm, you can then play. They can physically play and use their fingers, which they need to play, but they're playing their forearms and it's silent. That's another way that you can practice,
Yeah,
and have them be silent too. Um, I think that's great. And we haven't even talked about the rest of the band. I mean, there can be behavior everywhere. If it's too hard and they give up, or it's too easy and they don't need to try. I mean, finding that sweet spot's really important. That's why I've always been an advocate of try to choose music ahead of time best you can and be okay to change music if you feel like it doesn't fit the group you have.
exactly. And understanding that the group you have and not just changes from year to year, it changes
Mm-hmm.
from month to month, especially with the younglings there in middle school that are just physically changing so much almost before your eyes. I've seen conductors over the years. I mean, it's okay to recycle pieces, but sometimes they're on like a schedule where they
Mm-hmm.
recycle, like a 4-year rotation or 5-year rotation. And I think that's important in some respects because the students, there's just certain literature the students need to know. They really, really do. And you're doing them a disservice if you don't expose them to certain things. But then if you look back over programs and at that one school and you can like say for assessment and you keep seeing the same pieces in a rotation, it may fit the group, but you have a different group all the time with different strengths. And even if you have a high school band that they can just play anything that you put in front of them, but you're still going to have strengths and cool players. You want to look for pieces that highlight
Mm-hmm.
that time that you had 3 bassoons in your high school band.
Sure.
You know what I mean? So
American salute.
you want to find that.
We were talking about this episode. You said one of your strengths is being able to diagnose problems on the podium and being able to fix the issues you hear as much as you can, whether you have 2 or 3 months or you have 2 or 3 hours, like in an honor band setting. And I mean, not that we're going to be able to get all that information from you today. That's taken you many, many years to figure that out. But I wanted to go through and list a number of the things that you talked about when you're saying diagnosing musical problems in rehearsal, be efficient with your students' time. I think that's a huge part. I love that efficiency word because your kids know if you're wasting their time or if they're basically on, I use the word like being on the treadmill. Like if they're on your treadmill and they have to keep up with you, I think that's a really great rehearsal pace to have. So I'm going to list a bunch of these off and then we'll see what we want to talk about.
Okay.
Okay. Listen carefully. Teach the students how to listen carefully. Learn to quickly figure out the root cause of a problem. Is it teacher error or is it student error? Usually student error, but however,
That's a biggie. That's a biggie right there.
yeah.
So the root cause of a problem could be anything. It could be they just counted wrong. That's an easy fix.
Mm-hmm.
Just do it again. The root cause, let's say that's happening, I don't know, measure 5. The problem might not be measure 5. The problem could be measure 3 going into measure 5. So you start to learn what was it that caused it. Was it the buildup into it, or did some instrument not come in, or maybe it's a beat 2 entrance, and what's happening on beat 1? Did you just get a strong beat 1, or is there a bass drum thing, or did the low folks miss an entrance on a strong? Sometimes you can just fix something by saying, I need a super strong beat 1 on that measure, and then everything's fixed. And so you just learn that. But some problems will just fix themselves.
And sometimes it's not complicated either. Like you're talking about beat 1 and a beat 2 entrance. Sometimes all it takes is you have to tell the band, you have to really count carefully. The bass drum is supposed to come in on count 1, but we know that there's a chance they might miss it. So make sure you count really carefully and then come in on beat 2, whether or not the bass drum enters or not.
But for the little ones, beat 2 entrances are difficult.
Sure.
And I actually try to include them even on my 0.5 music. It's just too important. They have to learn to count independently. And I mean, it's not my job to teach all the bands of the world that, but it's important. It's important, and it's interesting, to listen to. It's a cool, melodic or rhythmic line to hear, and so they just have to learn. It's not always simple, just count, but techniques, or to say something to your students like, breathe on beat 1, or you just teach them from the youngest times not to breathe on every rest, but especially just always breathe 1 beat before you come in, or just, you could even say, in this passage, I want you to breathe every time you have a quarter rest. Take a breath, because if you're taking a breath, you're certainly not making a sound. So, and then it helps set up for the next.
And I think it's really important, you learn to think like a kid. So if you can put yourself in their position and say, how do I do this at the most basic level, to be able to, that's important to be able to explain it to them.
Because we forget, it was hard for us at one point to come in on a beat 2. Now it's no big deal. And so we just have to keep remembering that.
Well, if you think about it, as they get older, it's harder to come in on the and then as you get even older, it's harder to come in on the E or the right? I mean, it's all the same. Perhaps a compositional error, so maybe occasionally there's something in the piece that is not right that you need to fix. I haven't found that a ton, but your music theory is really important. A tip I would give people, I don't know how you would quickly analyze, say you hadn't done the score study, but especially for young band, for me, I find 90% of the time I can look at the low brass parts and figure out what the harmonies are supposed to be. So I like that you included there's a potential error that maybe editors and composers missed.
I'm not even talking about a note error or things like that hopefully your ear will pick up, if something isn't right. And then, I always would tell my students, don't assume, if you're playing the right note, it, and it's not sounding right, you raise your hand, because, it easily could be an editing error. But I'm not even talking about that. I'm talking about the first clarinets have the melody, like you're talking to your band, how come you're overbalancing? I need to hear more melody. And then you actually look at the score and realize not very many people were given the melody. And then the instruments that were given the melody are softer instruments balanced against like your entire low, so you might have to do reorchestrating or
Sure.
things like that. Or, compositionally, maybe something also isn't laying well with, there's some kind of weird fingering or a trill, like on a saxophone going from a B to a C. Like that's not going to work without an alternate fingering. And so you might hear that something's just not right and you can't figure it out. When that happens, I would just say to my students, we're just going to come back to that. I need to look at that closer, instead of beat it to death.
Yeah, and when you say that, you put the culture in a place where they see that you don't know something at the moment, and that says a lot on them too.
Right. And
Yeah.
if you make a mistake, tell them. Oops,
Then
I shouted out the wrong number, or sometimes I would say to kids, oops, Miss Estes needs to learn how to read music. Sorry.
The next two tips you gave are literally a full podcast in themselves, but we're going to kind of brush on them today. Only focus on one or two concepts at a time, especially for the young kids. Be concise and precise with your feedback. Always say what went well first and then what to improve on next. I've also heard that talked about use it as a sandwich, where it's like compliment and then work on something and then end with a compliment too.
There's always something that you can say to a student that's positive. Always. I don't care how bad the sound was, how ugly, how offensive. You can compliment their energy. But you just always need to find something nice and then say, but let's use a little less air, or dial down that energy from a 10 to, let's say, a 7. Or when you do that, make sure you're listening to so and so. They'll appreciate that too. And always make your comments not personal, pedagogical and to the music, non-personal.
And you'll be able to teach them better when you have a good relationship with them. So that's got to come first. You put here at the end in capital letters, so I want to make sure we really get it. Always get to beat one together. What do you mean by that?
Oh my gosh. You can't do anything if you're not together. So I would always teach my students, didn't matter what the level was, my level 6 high school band, or just whenever I do a beat one, you better be on beat one. And that everything else will then fall into place. I would tell my kids, you can play all the right notes, but if they're at all the wrong times, it's just a bunch of wrong.
Yeah, and I think one of the ways that happens a lot, I have a lot of students who do this. They might mess up one beat of a rhythm, but they play the rest of it perfectly. Well, if you go forward, they've played 4 measures one beat late or one beat early.
Exactly. A bunch of right notes at the wrong time. And so I actually teach my students, we play through beat ones. I just call it beat ones. We're going to play every beat one, and you can go through a piece super fast. You can cite like that, so that they can hear. You could do it as quarter notes. You could do it as long notes. Okay, here's measure 1, measure 2, measure 3. Just go in order like that. If the kids can hear, this is what each beat one sounds like.
Interesting.
Then they know when they're off. And I also would teach them along those lines, if they get ahead or behind, instead of trying to catch up or slow down, they just need to stop and jump to the next beat one. Just always find beat one, because once everything is lining up vertically, then all the right notes fall into place a lot easier. You can I mean, it's almost like magic. There's so many things you don't have to say. If they can all get to beat one, then they can do a lot of fixing on their own.
Next, I'm really excited to get into your story about how you were a band director for so long, and then all of a sudden you say you didn't burn out. You just decided to try a new career venture, which is as a composer. So, what was that story like?
So many people think, oh, did you always want to become a composer? And you finally realized a dream. And that was never, ever a thought. In fact, I had a weird composing experience in high school. My best friend turned out to be a wonderful composer. She has her doctorate in theory and she's been a composer for many years. But she was already composing in high school. And so I thought I'd try my hand at it. And I wrote a little something that I was very proud of. And I said, here, take a look at this. And I played it for her and she looked right at me. And she goes, that's Eleanor Rigby. And I said, no, it's not. And I knew it was, mostly Eleanor Rigby. So anyway, it just was never a thought of mine. I always reorchestrated things at will. I'm a firm believer in do whatever you have to do to make your band sound right. If you have to rebalance something, reorchestrate something. But that was the extent of what I did. And then what turned out to be my final year of teaching, we were doing a superhero themed concert. I happened to have 16 double reads, and I was like, how often can you have that? So I'm looking for superhero things. I mean, I knew I wasn't going to find anything because it's hard to find anything for a double reed ensemble. And so I thought, okay, I'll write something. And I downloaded Note Flight. But what you also have to understand is the last several years of my teaching, as more music writing software was available, I mean, I just didn't want to learn it. I was like, I think I'm going to retire before I ever have to learn something like that. So I'm not even gonna, my brain can only hold so much, so I'm not even gonna try to put that in my brain. Well, so I downloaded Note Flight and I wrote, arranged a piece, for my double reed ensemble, which I'm not gonna say what it is because I'm sure I broke copyright rules. And it was a big hit, and it was a piece that was the opposite of what you would ever think double reeds would do. And I realized I might have a talent for this. And this was very late in the school year. I mean, it was a spring concert. And then I'm not a person that takes leaps of faith. I had never really done anything like that. And it was year 36. And I thought, my cousin asked me the question. She goes, what is going to be different this year than next year if you want to do this? And the answer was like, nothing. It'll just be me getting started a year later. I thought I can always go back to teaching. I can always, get another school. And so I turned in my resignation and began composing.
You said the first two pieces you sent in were accepted, the first one within an hour. And that's pretty awesome.
Yeah, I I just thought maybe I'll write some marches. I like marches, and there's a formula, and I thought, okay, I'll do that. So my first piece was Kvetcher's Surprises in Controversial Time. I just thought, I'm going to write, I love marches, but it's like the opposite of a march. It's like an anti-march. It's like, there are no horn offbeats. There are some time changes just to throw people off. It starts out with trombone glissando and things like that. And so I submitted it on Halloween day of 2019. And then within the hour, I mean, when I pushed send, I thought either I'm never going to hear back or I'll hear back with a rejection. My whole goal was maybe someday some band will be nice enough to play this one piece one time. and they accepted it. And so then that night I was like, well, if they liked the first one, then I'll just go ahead and submit the second one, which was a traditional march, both level 2, and they accepted it. And so
That's so
I'm
awesome.
very thankful to Excelsia and Larry Clark and Tyler Arcari. Oh my gosh, they've
Yep.
been.
That's awesome. And you write that your mission is to write quality literature, no pandering down to the younglings. What do you mean by that?
I don't think it's as prevalent now because there's so much wonderful new fresh writing over the last few years. But for most of my career, it was just really hard to find music for the youngest students that didn't sound like somebody wrote it harder and then they tried to make it easier, like really easier, or some weird melody that just keeps repeating ad nauseum and boring parts. And it was just always hard to find quality music that was super geared for that grade level, those youngest levels. And that's what I wanted. Like my bassoons would come up to me, how come we have to be with the tubas all the time? And I'd be like, you don't.
You don't.
You don't. And so, things like that.
Sure. And then the second part you wrote, I just want to mention, to write engaging literature for all instrument sections, especially the low voices and percussion. So next, what we're going to get to is listening to a little bit of your music. And again, I want to thank very much Excelsia Music and Mark Custom Recording for allowing us to use this music. First, I wanted to mention earlier this summer, we did a bunch of repertoire lists. We did a big repertoire list in I think it was 6 or 7 different parts. And I know we featured at least one of your pieces. We did 0.5 as a beginning band piece. I don't know if we did any more, but it was at least one. That's when I kind of started really learning about your music.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah. And so what we're going to do is show people a couple pieces of yours that we want to highlight. First, let's talk about Cook Strait Crossing. What's the story behind that piece?
Oh, well, I was researching and I came upon New Zealand. I thought, let's find out about New Zealand. And I
Can I give you a fun fact?
Yeah.
My great grandfather was the prime minister of New Zealand in the 1920s.
No
Isn't that
way.
awesome? Yeah, I've never been there, but he was like, yeah. So anyways, and my grandmother worked for the embassy before she moved to the United States. She was the one ready to press the button to explode the place if she had to.
Oh my gosh.
She was amazing. I love that lady. Anyway, sorry, I digress.
That is so cool. That is so cool. Well, I didn't know anything about New Zealand, and so I just started reading about the culture and the history of New Zealand and, some things with the language. And pretty soon in my research, I know it's surrounded by water. And I came across that devastating passenger ferry called the Wahine that sank in 1968. And it seems like ancient history, but 1968, I was 9 years old, but I don't remember any news about that passenger ferry. So it just struck me as just a wonderful story. It just affected me. And so,
do you know what the word Wahine means?
I think female.
Yeah, it refers to a Maori or a Polynesian woman.
Yes. Yep. Like lady. In fact, I wanted to call the piece the Wahine. Wahine. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
See, I offered something to this conversation.
Yeah, no, but I learned that. I've heard it pronounced both ways. I wasn't sure, but thank you for telling me that. It happened on Cook Strait, so I called it Cook Strait Crossing.
And the recording we're going to use was by the William Mason High School Band. And actually, I wanted to mention, if people haven't heard it, back in December, I forget what episode it was, maybe 50 something, 58 with Ed Protzman. And before they went out, I did a whole interview with him about their program and that they were going out and all that. And I remember them mentioning, because if part of that episode, we went through his whole program and what he was going to play. And this is one of the pieces they mentioned.
I think I remember that.
Yep.
I listened to that episode and I wrote Ed an email and I said, thank you. That's right. Thank you for mentioning. I forgot about that.
So what's cool about this piece? Besides the fact that it was performed at Midwest, I mean, that's
I
awesome.
know. I can't believe. I'm so thankful. I still can't believe it. So the music that I find at level one just doesn't have opportunities often enough featuring solo sections, solo person, And so what I did in this piece, it's kind of broke rules. We usually in a level one piece, it starts out fast and loud and whatever, but I start out kind of slow in this. And then there's a section at the very beginning for alto and flute. And it could be director's choice. And that's one of the cool things about this piece. So if you're playing this piece and you've got a dynamite alto section, your whole alto section can feature it as a solo, or it could be combined flute and alto, which in some cases is half the band. And so they're not, so you're not dealing with, kids being scared to play, a soloistic type section, because again, you usually can have a lot of flutes and a lot of altos. And so it just features director's choice on how you want to structure that section.
Mm-hmm.
And the recording that you're going to hear, the way that Mason High School did it was they started out with alto and then split it up between alto solo and a flute solo. And they actually had the kids stand up during it, which I thought was really, really neat.
And they used the ship's bell, which is not in the original.
Yes, and they asked me, can we add a ship's bell? And I was like, I wish I had thought about that, and I would have written a part for ship's bell. So that was a good suggestion. And so I actually did research on the types of ship's bells and what are the bell signals that the passengers of the Wahine would have heard when they departed and when they were entering Cook Strait. What do the bells sound like? And so that's how those bell sounds were incorporated. But again, I mean, it's not it, but if anybody does play the piece, I say feel free to do whatever you want.
That's great.
With that, because I think it's pretty cool.
Okay, so we're going to check out the recording and we're going to let everybody see the piece as we do it. We'll do score and sound on this. Again, thanks to Excelsia and Mark Custom Records for this. I did want to mention, I mean, as we listened to the Mason Band play this, when I met with them, I was so impressed. They were BOA top 5 marching band in middle November, end of November, whatever it was. And then within 5 weeks, their wind ensemble was playing at Midwest. To me, it's like these amazing moments back within one. So it's just such a great program. Anyway, I digress. Let's listen to the piece. Here's Cook Strait Crossing. It's such a cool piece. C minor, which you mentioned earlier, is so classic. And I love it when composers use the major four chord in a minor key. That's such a great sound. I don't know if that comes from a tradition in any way. I feel like that happened a lot in a lot of the early band music, but I just thought I'd mention that. Yeah, and the percussion. It's like it's simple percussion, but it's engaging, and there's enough for them to play.
Well, the percussion, I was very purposeful on the instruments that I chose. So you have the ocean instruments, to depict the weather, the rain stick, the wind chimes, the ocean drum and
Sure.
things like that. Then the other instruments, I researched what were the most traditional instruments I hope I'm saying it right, the Maori,
Maori.
Maori,
Maori. Yep.
what were the most traditional instruments that they would use. So there were the castanets, the tom, the gongs. So those were the instruments that I found that most sounded like the traditional instruments. And then I wrote the percussion rhythms uh, in a haka the best that I could.
Yep.
And so, did you catch that?
I actually didn't, but I wanted to mention that if people haven't seen the haka, it's the Maori intimidation war dance. And if you ever want to see it, there's the rugby team from New Zealand. It's called the All Blacks, and they do it at the midfield line before each rugby match. And it wouldn't like imagine these guys who are 300 pounds and zero fat.
Yeah, I watched those. I watched a bunch of ceremonial hakas, wedding hakas.
Mm-hmm.
And so I just noticed they're mostly in 3/4 time. And so I just incorporated those rhythms in
That's
the
awesome.
music and in the percussion. And the beginning part is like a welcome haka, the solo section. So anyway, I tried to incorporate that.
It's a great piece. It's a great piece.
Thanks.
I love it. I really hope a lot of people do it. Um, I also wanted to mention if anybody else is looking for another piece, that's a New Zealand piece. There's also Paul Murtha's arrangement of the Wellerman, which is available in Flex Band as well, and that's great. If anybody else is looking for a second piece, do this one first, but after that would be another one good one to do too. Okay, we're going to feature one more of your pieces. This is called Sinterklaas's Rooftop Ride.
Yes.
Let's see, it's a quirky holiday piece depicting the Dutch tradition of Sinterklaas slipping and sliding on the rooftops while delivering gifts to children. Features slow trombone, glissando, dissonance of a minor second, tempo change, a couple quick meter changes, and a grand pause. Lots of sound effects and a hoarse whinny.
Yeah, the Excelsior asked me to write a holiday piece, and so I will tend towards secular pieces. And so I did some research and I thought, well, there's this person called Sinterklaas, over there in the Netherlands. And so I thought, okay, if he's showing up and he rides a horse on rooftops in the middle of December, I figured that was going to be pretty icy, and then he would be sliding and slipping, and so that's what gave me the idea. But what I didn't know was during the recording session, I was in the audience. I was real happy to be in the audience, and they did the horse whinny, and I couldn't hear it. And so I asked, can you, make the horse whinny louder? Like, I can't believe I'm asking this famous trumpet player to do that. And there was like something that they altered sustained notes during that time, those two measures at the very end, so that you could hear it come out better. But this is what he said. He said, in all of trumpet canon, there's only one other horse whinny. I was like, I didn't know that.
Sleigh ride.
Now there's two.
Now there's two.
I just thought, why hasn't anybody else written a horse whinny? It makes me want to write another one someplace. But they did an excellent job, and I love this horse whinny.
Before we listen to it, in case people need to teach their trumpet players how to do a horse whinny, it's actually quite easy. Push the valves halfway down, start high, go to low, and shake the instrument. And that's going to sound like a horse whinny. Just don't press the valves all the way down or all the way up, and you'll be fine.
Halfway.
So the second horse whinny in history. So Laura Estes and Leroy Anderson are side by side here. This is awesome.
Oh my gosh, don't say that in the same sentence. My name is.
All right, let's check it out. Here's Sinterklaas's Rooftop Ride. It's such a funny piece. Laughing as I hear it. I don't know if you've heard of the composer Dan Buckfitch. He's a famous composer and writer of and teacher out in Idaho. Anyway, I digress. He often says that to write music to make people laugh is the hardest thing to do. He said you can write something to make people feel proud or make people cry, but to make people laugh is so hard, and you definitely succeed with that piece.
Thank you. That is my goal. I really want people to chuckle throughout the piece. So thank you because I've got a weird sense of humor, I guess. I'm a little quirky myself. And so I hope it's well received, the piece. But I like it. Did you catch the temple block solo in there?
Yeah.
Tuba solo, poor neglected temple block people and neglected tuba people. I just want to try and find cool things for them. Trombones. I mean, they joined bands so that they could use that slide. So
for sure.
So anyway, I just try to keep those things in mind and throw them in when I can.
So last question I have for you. If people want to reach out to you for either advice or to maybe have custom arrangements or commission or with arranging ideas or writing ideas, is that something you're open to?
Absolutely. I would be honored.
Laura, I appreciate so much having you on. Thanks for spending the time, sharing everything and sharing your time and your music with all of us. Is there something coming up that you're excited about?
Yes. I have 2 commissions going right now, my first 2, and I'm super excited about those because, again, I just haven't been composing for that long, so I just feel like I'm a baby in this area. But there's one commission that I'm almost finished with, and it's a full orchestra commission that's with tiered string levels.
Great.
So that's been taking some time, and I'm enjoying how that's come out. And then I have a level 1 commission that'll be due, I think in February. So I'm excited about that. Flattered and grateful that people ask me.
I did want to push back real quick. That's my nice way of saying I disagree with you. You say that you're a baby in this, but if you think about all of your background in being a band director, you're not just doing this for the last 5 years. Like, you're taking knowledge that you've had for a really long time and you've built. So think of it as you've been doing it for that long. Even though you're a newer writer, your knowledge is not 5 years old.
I do agree with you on that. I am that is, if I had started doing this even 20 years ago, there would have been more of a steeper learning curve even then. But yeah, you're right. You're right. The experience of teaching all of my students all of these years, because when I'm writing something, I can immediately think back on a band or a
person.
yeah, definitely a person, or somebody having trouble with something. I'm like, oh, don't write it like that again or something. But yeah, you're right. Thank you.
We sincerely appreciate you taking your valuable time and listening to the Growing Band Director podcast. Your students are very lucky to have a band director like you. If you have any suggestions for episode topics or think you have an area of expertise to share on a show with us, please reach out. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to help spread the word, please give us a 5-star review and tell your band director friends to subscribe as well. We're available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, our YouTube channel, and wherever you listen to podcasts. Thanks for listening to The Growing Band Director. See you next week.